Good afternoon and good early morning to Steve. Hello. We are starting the afternoon session, at least afternoon here in Europe, for our Teams conference. And we have several speakers after interesting discussion this morning. And the first of them is Steve Recca, which is the Executive Director of Center of Human Security at University of Colorado University, or Colorado Springs. He also serves as Humanitarian Assistant Program Advisor in Pacific Disaster Center. And also he used to be the Director of Center of Homeland Security of University of Colorado. Maybe Steve, you may fulfill another. I am getting it from LinkedIn, so this is your profile. So if you want to tell something more about you personally, it is possible. I would like to start this session with you. Please, the floor is yours, and we are listening to your paper.
Very good. Thank you, Yaroslav, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And I notice just in the people that I know on the call right now on the Zoom session that we're really scattered across the globe and at all different time zones. Binod from India, good evening to you. I hope all is well. So let me share my screen and I'll begin the presentation. It's typical with our business. My original plan was to be briefing you from the continental United States, from Colorado, where I live, but meetings have brought me to the state of Hawaii this week, and so it's even a bit earlier there, but hopefully I won't wake up the neighbors here in the hotel room. So in the 25 minutes we have, and this will go by very quickly, I think all of us appreciate that, I was asked to talk about risk and how we leverage risk in our world. What I'd like to do is do that, but first talk to you a little bit about the Pacific Disaster Center. So as Yaroslav mentioned, I work with the Pacific Disaster Center, which is an applied science center under the University of Hawaii. Now, while I have other work that I do in security and disaster management with the University of Colorado, and a bit with FEMA through the Naval Postgraduate School, my work principally is with the Pacific Disaster Center. So a brief description here, because I think there's some value in helping you understand how the resources that PDC has might be useful in the work that we all do. So again, I mentioned Pacific Disaster Center, part of the University of Hawaii. Our role as an applied science center is to build that bridge between what we do in science to make it usable for decision makers. So those of us who work on the academic side, the science side, we have a very different audience. It's a very different level of comfort with uncertainty. Our vocabulary is different. How we connect, how we communicate, very different from those that are making decisions in disaster management. But PDC, again, is designed to be that bridge to communicate the best science, the best modeling available out to both the general public, but also policy decision makers, elected officials, so that they can make decisions based on the best information without having to be scientists themselves. And we do this through data, and that's really the focus of my presentation today. So the notion of bringing in data from every validated source that we can through hazard advisories, imagery, forecast observations, et cetera, you see on the left-hand side, and putting that through a lens that has modeling, analysis, and assessments through a tool that this disasterware, I'll describe that briefly later, to get that into a focused, decision-enabled, actionable bit of information for decision makers, right? So that's PDC, the Pacific Disaster Center, in a nutshell. And I mentioned disasterware. Again, that tool is available to you right now, and there are a variety of ways to access that. For the general public, there's a public-facing tool if you go to our website at pdc.org. that's available for emergency and disaster managers. We have a Disaster Aware Pro that's available, again, through a registration process, but again, it's no cost. And all the data we have in the system is available for public sector emergency and disaster managers. For those in private sector, please contact me if you have questions. PDC and the partner have developed a private sector version of this as well. So, it's gotten me thinking about, as we talk about risk and we think about the complex challenges we have globally. And again, the upper left-hand corner, while it's a sad situation, it makes me laugh. There's serious parking problems in Belgium. The challenges are great and they're diverse, right? And we all appreciate that. That's our field, that's our background. And so the question is, how bad is it? How do we think about it? And most importantly, in our profession, what do we do about it? And how do we advise those that need to make decisions in this space? This is a quick snapshot from Disaster Aware. I took this last night of events, hazards around the world, from earthquake to tsunami issues, drought, civil unrest, volcanic activity, just a snapshot of one part of the globe that I could capture here. So yep, there are things going on all the time. There's no doubt about that. There's no surprise to those that work in the field. But the question again for us is, what do we do about it? And then we factor in this notion that are disasters becoming more frequent and they're becoming larger, and is that inevitable? And my short answer there is maybe, but it's how we think about disasters, and that's what I want to take a minute or two to talk about next. We appreciate that disasters really are a function of the hazard itself and its impact on humans and infrastructure. All right, so we can have a significant hurricane in the middle Atlantic or a typhoon in the middle of the Pacific that does not impact humans or infrastructure, and it's not a disaster, right? But that same event, as it approaches land, as it approaches human activity, can become, in fact, a challenge for us as disaster and emergency managers. So bad news is, in some areas, things are getting worse, right? So, and part of this is how we think about human activity and how that human activity continues to grow, expand, and exacerbate problems in areas prone to the hazards, right? So building, the previous slide, it was taken from some work we've done in Sierra Leone, where we're seeing more activity, more housing developments in areas that are not ideally suited for living. And why is that? Because it's cheaper, right? So people move to areas, people build where they can, but the challenge there is they're more likely then to have a larger impact based on the event. We're seeing climate change impacts, the notion of what we expect from changes in the climate. I think we're familiar with the general nature of it, but that likely is going to make things more challenging for us as we consider the impact of the hazards. The most important here is, as we think about disasters, are they inevitable? No, but it's how we understand the risk that we place ourselves in human activity. And maybe some good news, right? So we look at a trend line for natural disasters over the last 4 decades, and we see that trend increased, but it more or less peaked there, with most common disasters being flooding and storm events. But it's peaked, and it's remained relatively constant for the last decade and a half or so. We'll see if that trend continues, but the really, again, as we think of disasters, the human element is the focus, not just the hazards themselves, which, again, as we think of tropical storms, the notion of tropical storms being larger because of warmer ocean temperatures, that makes sense, right? We appreciate that, but it's the human impact, again, that most of us are most concerned about. So what do we know? We expect more of the same in areas that are being hit now. South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the areas I work in, the Caribbean, Central America, and the US Gulf Coast. as we think of the major flooding types of major hazard types of flooding, storms, and of course, biomedical. So we know that. We know to expect that. It's no surprise to us. And then to take advantage of somebody else's language here, the known unknowns, we also know to expect a rapid onset events like volcanoes, earthquakes, Ebola, not so much a rapid onset, but something, again, that continues, those biomedical events that continue to catch us a little bit by surprise. The next variant of COVID, or again, biomedical event that we don't quite anticipate, right? So we know those are coming. The question then is, how do we think about, how do we prepare for the unknowns, those that we don't really know, haven't really planned for, haven't thought about? And my answer, short answer at 3 o'clock in the morning here in the island of Oahu, is data, and getting more and better data, and how we leverage that to understand risk. So PDC has a methodology. It's under a broad heading of the National Disaster Preparedness Baseline Assessment Program. And this is part of a multi-phased way to assess risk, but also to provide actionable risk intelligence to countries. It's done at the national level, but most important, the methodology includes work at the sub-national level. So as all of us know, disasters are local. The impacts may be national, they may be global, but disasters themselves are local. So how we think about preparing for building resilience in a community, reducing vulnerability, increasing coping capacity is something to we consider in our field. So as we think of risk and the components of risk, PDC breaks it down into a multi-hazard exposure, and then components of vulnerability, coping capacity, and the disaster management capabilities. What we're looking for is to get a multi-hazard risk understanding. So we have, depending where we are in the globe, again, I'm on the island of Oahu, which just went through a major storm event earlier this week that brought high winds, lots of rain, and therefore flooding, potential dam overflows, dam breaks. And so we look at, the multi-hazard, in this case, of flooding, wind damage, other water inundation issues. But it's important from that point then to see how that hazard impacts populations, and where, as we look at risk, how we can build resiliency into our systems. So again, our components of risk include the multi-hazard exposure, vulnerability, coping capacity, and disaster management capability. So taking a look a step further, where we go from here is looking at the subcomponents of each of these categories. And this is just pulled from the vulnerability component, but looking at some of the subcomponents in the center section here that includes population pressures, gender inequality, and down the list that you can read. So from that, then what we're looking at is understanding the indicators in each of these subcomponents, that if we can adjust the indicator, we might have a more significant impact on the subcomponent, and therefore on the larger component of risk, and therefore reducing overall multi-hazard risk. I don't have it here in the slide deck, but an example I like to consider is based on some work in Central America. We knew that a segment of Nicaragua was particularly vulnerable. That was clear to the Disaster Management Authority in Nicaragua. But why? The question is, how do we understand it so we can make a difference, so we can look at either national funding or third-party donors, other funding to support disaster management capability in that area. And so that the idea of getting down to an indicator level was critical. And what we found was that coping capacity in that sub-region was lacking, right? So the population did not have significant coping capacity. And then we looked further down into infrastructure issues that were causing that. And that drove us down to healthcare access, which further drove us down to the number of beds per X number of people in the population. In this case, the indicator we had was beds per 10,000 people. So if we're going to make an investment in that area, what we're looking for is that at that indicator level, how do we adjust? How do we build more beds? Is that it? Or do we build transportation networks to additional hospitals? How do we identify those critical areas where we need to make our disaster management investments? So I mentioned early on that PDC has a platform called DisasterWare, and this is a plug for the platform, but I say that only as I look at how do I think of using and leveraging data to support my decision making. I mentioned already DisasterWare has a public-facing version, but for us in the field, DisasterWare itself, DisasterWare Pro, is available to us through a simple registration process. And again, reach out to me through my contact information to get more information there. But the idea is data, and not data for data's sake, but how we leverage that data through layering it with infrastructure information, population, demographic information, so that we can work on areas that are important to lifelines in an emergency. These are some of the features that DisasterWare has. Their ability to work through communicating among partners, setting up sit reps. It's the essence of having multiple sources of information at your fingertips, literally, to make decisions. And so some of the features here and how we look at the data, the forecasting information, the risk and vulnerability information I mentioned already, how we identify and place critical infrastructure. But the trick is, how do we layer these together to inform and make better decisions? Part of what we do, and as we leverage DisasterWare, is the partnership aspect. So PDC looks for the best data available, but also in those we'll have those agencies, those organizations that have an impact in the space we work in. So we work very closely with UNOCHA and the regional offices, World Food Program and the regional offices. These are two samples of reports and recent reports in the last year where we've worked closely with either World Food Program or UNOCHA to do impact reports in advance of events and then post-event as well. So on the left, you see it's a super typhoon Goni that struck the Philippines a little over a year ago. And on the right-hand side, earlier this year, the earthquake that hit Haiti. Right? So these are this use of data to build and support models that to provide an immediate snapshot. So I have a general situational awareness of what has happened, what the event has led to, and what the potential needs might be. Right? So the modeling capability here really is tremendous. And these are automated products. So again, useful for you as we work in our field. Another sample product, this is called the event brief, where again, just take a quick look here of some of the data that's available just on this one slide. The ability to understand a snapshot of where the event happened, which population has been exposed, what level, which demographics have been most exposed, and then on the right-hand side, the impact on power, communication, transportation, lifelines, and the estimated breakdown of key needs in advance of this typhoon. Right? So this is all pre-event modeling. It's a quick snapshot of what the situation is and what we might need to do to ameliorate the damage. Okay, I'm just about out of time. I see there's both the chat and Q&A. The challenges we face in disaster management, I think are clear on one level, but there's also a great deal of uncertainty because while we plan, while we prepare, it's what else haven't we done? And more importantly, perhaps in a very practical sense, is we have information available to us now. How do we use that information in a way to take advantage of the data to make life-saving decisions, to plan, prepare, to exercise for in advance, and then during a response, to have that data that are available to make better and faster decisions. So my leave for you is we've done well in the past. We always have more to do. The challenge of resting on our laurels is always there, but how we think about and how we prepare for the future is really based on what we learn now, and not fight the last disaster management event we had. So again, reporting in from Hawaii, that is not an actual photo from last night's sunset, but it could have been. And my suggestion to the group here is we consider that we do our next annual conference. Well, maybe after Washington, D.C. Next year, or the EMI next year, that we do our next annual conference here. PDC would love to host. Okay, with that, I think I'm about 4 minutes out. Let me take a quick look at the Q&A. If I'm pronouncing your name, Segun, correctly, natural hazards, do we have natural disasters? The short answer, besides terminology, is yes. So we have the hazard, it's natural, and that hazard can become a disaster once it hits, it impacts humans and infrastructure. So is it still a natural event, natural disaster? I'm not sure that's so important for how we think about our business, the work we do, but the notion of that hazard, that earthquake, that flooding event, that ice storm impacting us, it can become a disaster, as a natural hazard. So probably not much of an answer, but maybe there. Are we involved? Yoland, excuse me if I mispronounced that. Are we involved in data collecting currently in the South Sudan flooding disaster? So I do not have direct experience in South Sudan. The Pacific Disaster Center has not worked directly in South Sudan, but what we do is we gather data from international organizations that are working in the space, and we add that into disasterware. So the short answer is not a lot of experience there, but I'd be glad to follow up with you if that would be useful to talk more about how we might think about the situation you mentioned in South Sudan.
Steve, thank you very much. It was very nice presentation, and I am looking forward to meet you in the United States next year, whatever place it will be, because I think the most important is the huge background of crisis management information and people skilled and knowledgeable. So really, I'm looking forward to the next year conference.
Very good. Thank you, Yaroslav. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be associated with the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have a next paper. Again, it's coming Roman Tandlich with his team. That's another team that was morning. And I presented Roman this morning. So he will go directly to the thing, which is public service and private stakeholders in the listeriosis outbreak in South Africa, some ethical reflections. So Roman, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Yaroslav. So I'll try to maintain the high level of quality that was just by Steve for this afternoon session. I thought that was a really interesting presentation. My second talk of the day will be from a slightly different project, which has ended last year. This was dealing with the health preparedness in South Africa, and one of the case studies that one of my students looked at, this is Eunice Vhiriri. So I would like to start by acknowledging my co-authors. The first one, this is actually Eunice Vhiriri was the master student that completed this work. And then my co-authors, Yoland, Irwin, and Richard Laubscher, and myself were working with Eunice during her degree. The paper that I'm going to present today is a second one on the topic of listeriosis, and I will try to cover ethical implications of the outbreak and what are the lessons learned that need to be addressed going forward. Now, I will just start by a little bit of a background, some context information about South Africa. South Africa has a complex disaster profile. Before COVID-19, there were already quite a few infectious diseases that were impacting the fabric of society. I would almost say HIV and AIDS being one of them, but also tuberculosis. These resources proved valuable in monitoring these resources prove valuable during various infectious disease outbreaks and epidemics in recent times. For example, during COVID, we managed to use the monitoring capacity to start looking at COVID relatively quickly, but there was also a lot of experience in dealing with large-scale treatment campaigns, as South Africa runs the largest treatment campaign on HIV and AIDS in the world. However, there were also other challenges which continue to be a problem. These were tornadoes, floods. Currently in COVID, we also have a drought in the Eastern Cape where I'm located, but also devastating fires in informal settlements where building codes and other building regulations are often not adhered. So challenges arose also in the preparation for the World Cup, and then also due to international engagement such as INSARA capacity and problems in assisting in the disaster zone in the Haiti earthquake in 2010. Later on, South African government and the disaster management structures worked hard to undo these problems. So quite a lot of work has been done between 2011 and the outbreak starting in 2017. These were mainly focused on the improvement in urban search and rescue capacity, in putting in place regulations in dealing with big gatherings and so on. Existing resources have also been repurposed quite well during the recent COVID outbreak, in an example, for the pediatric ward. However, what happened was that even though the system was relatively well developed, there are still challenges that remain. And one of them was exposed in 2017 and 2018 when South Africa experienced the world's largest outbreak. I call it outbreak in quotation marks. I will explain exactly why that is the case in the history of the world, where a total of 1,060 patients were diagnosed and confirmed to have contracted listeriosis between a period from the beginning of about 2017 until about middle to late 2018. The number of fatalities was alarming, as listeriosis is not a common disease. That means it occurs in South Africa annually with about 60 to 80 cases in a country of 60 million. But the rates at which it occurs have not posed large challenges on the public healthcare system. However, when the 2017-2018 outbreak happened, about 20% of the people that were infected died, which means that this made it a major challenge and a very dangerous infectious disease. Now, one of the reasons why the outbreak proved to be a challenge, and I will try to also highlight this towards the end of my presentation, that actually we consider this a disaster, was because there was a lot of similarities between the symptoms of listeriosis, which were meningitis, diarrhea, fever, and vomiting, quite specific symptoms, which are also common in other diseases. Even, for example, with COVID, you will see that diarrhea and fever are common. So it is very difficult to classify listeriosis as listeriosis unless you conduct extensive tests. This was prior to the outbreak complicated by the fact that listeriosis wasn't on the list of notifiable diseases. What does that mean? A notifiable disease is a set of conditions which are of great public concern, COVID, for example, being an example. And this is a list that changes generally between country to country slightly, but highly infectious diseases are put on this list. And if any medical practitioner or any healthcare practitioner suspects that a patient might be suffering from a notifiable disease, they need to immediately notify public health authorities and government public health authorities in the respective country. So this was not the case prior to the 2017, which is what caused problems in the initial tracking and tracing down the causative agent of this outbreak. And then finally, what happened was that ready-to-eat meats, similar to salami, something which we call in South Africa polony, was identified as the source of the outbreak. So in this next couple of slides, I will try to outline some of the ethical challenges that were derived from the outbreak, observed during the outbreak, and they also indicate long-term impacts on the emergency and also healthcare system in South Africa. So the methodology that we adopted was a combination between looking at the standards of principles of public health service in South Africa, and specifically the ethics of public service. These are summarized in many codes, but one of them, the most common one, is Batho Pele, or people first, and then also principle legislation of the conduct governing the public health service and public service in South Africa. So that was the one side of the equation that we looked at. The other side was the conduct of the stakeholders on the private side. So the manufacturer of the RTE meats and the products that were identified as the source of the outbreak, and then also how the outbreak and epidemic that followed impacted, and how consumers actually, what are the challenges that consumers faced in the face of the outbreak, and what are the lessons we can learn from the listeriosis outbreak in the content of the legislation and the standards, in the context of South Africa, and also in the process of implementing changes to prevent such a large-scale outbreak or epidemic from happening again. In the public sector, what actually happened was that the National Institute of Communicable Diseases, which has become very well known even worldwide during COVID, became one of the focal points of response of the government to this outbreak. What happened was that the overlap of the symptoms and also the general tracking down of the patients proved difficult, but ultimately NICD succeeded in tracking down all the patients, diagnosing them, and also, or at least we think it was all the patients. And what actually happened was that the action was proactive. Once the size of the problem started to become apparent, NICD and also the National Ministry of Health started acting quite quickly. The public health system adopted new diagnostic systems, the whole genome sequencing, and also other similar methods were adopted at the laboratory level. At the same time, what happened, listeriosis was, by the action of the Minister of Health, reclassified as a notifiable disease, and mandatory reporting became a very valuable tool to track down all the cases and ultimately decrease the burden of disease and the impact of the pandemic, of the epidemic on the South African society. What was a problem, however, was that investigations during the outbreak uncovered the fact that many abattoirs where raw meat for the production of the RTE meats was, and the polony was, were taken from, were not compliant, which means that they were not registered with the local government as is mandated by law. This again, in turn, pointed to the fact that the majority of the local government jurisdiction did not comply or were not able to carry out most of their functions, which they were required to do. If the abattoirs were to be registered and also periodically being inspected, it is very likely that the hygiene requirements would have been of a higher standard than they might have been during the outbreak. So one of the suggestions that was provided in the thesis, which was written up around the time we were about halfway into the first year of COVID, was that a skills audit should be conducted at the local government level to see if the environmental health practitioners, which are the people that are actually supposed to do the audits and conduct the inspections of abattoirs and other meat processing facilities, were up to scratch or not. But it is likely that such an audit would become redundant in the current COVID space-time, due to the fact that a lot of local government officials were at the first line in responding with the COVID. They played an important role in coordinating the response to it, and it is likely that their awareness of infectious diseases has improved. Now, but overall, we can say that the public healthcare sector complied with the constitutional and legislative mandates and also with their ethical obligations. However, one of the things that this resulted in was that right after a source of the outbreak was identified, which was an RTE meat processing facility in the north part of South Africa, A recall of all the products was ordered. This was complied with, even though reluctantly, by the producer. And the problem became that the producer started disputing the fact that the particular factory would have been the source of the outbreak. They openly started conducting their own investigations, sending additional samples to a laboratory overseas and dragging the process out. Ultimately, this resulted in class action suit where the victims of the outbreak, or people that have suffered, either their loved ones have died, or they have suffered miscarriages, as was the case with many female patients, or in some cases I will describe on the next couple slides, people suffered long-term morbidities. What happened was that these victims were forced to file a class action suit, which is still working its way through our courts, to get the producer to actually acknowledge their role and the full extent of the role in being the source of the outbreak, the one of the facility being the source of the outbreak. So what turned out to be the result of some studies that were done parallel to ours was that by the time the recall started happening in about December 2017, a lot of the financial damage was done, both in statistical value of life calculations, but also an impact on the loss of productivity and other economic indicators of the producer. This could have been a partial explanation for the lack of proactive conduct by the producer, but rather something of a dragged out approach, which is still playing itself out in the courts today. This is finally, there were also reports and analyses which have indicated that the RET meat producer in South Africa probably didn't have sufficient experience with crisis management, and their approach could have been different if they adopted an approach of quick response, quick recall that would have been self-initiated and not have been waited for until a few months after the first cases started being documented across South Africa. But the crisis management lack of experience with it were contrary to international examples like a meat producer from Canada in 2009 that faced a very similar scale outbreak, but relatively quickly, within weeks of identifying the source, they have recalled all the products, settled any class action, and their brand has rebounded. The South African producer has suffered major loss of value. Their share price has plummeted about, I think last time I checked, it was about 75%. And they had to sell off parts of their business, including the RET production facility, losing potential economic benefits down the line. So what were the other findings that had ethical implications? Miscarriages and severe neurological complications were observed even months after the outbreak was over. And this was all across all economic strata of society. So in a way, the listeriosis outbreak provided some hints about what could be expected when difficult to trace infectious diseases impact a large society like South Africa, which is a country of about 60 million people. From the fact that the patients and sufferers from the listeriosis were across all socioeconomic strata also points to a few commonalities between the consumption of RET meats and the source of nutrition proteins in South Africa. I will get back to this shortly. Now, the first outcome of our investigation is that it is clear that RET meats such as polony are often served across the places that are close to commuting hubs from low-income settlements. So as a result, the policies during the previous regime, which is prior to 1994, majority of the South African population, especially the ones that were Black South Africans, were marginalized to communities, which were placed in spatially isolated areas, which forced them again to commute large distances to economic hubs. That's still prevailing today in many areas. And in these under these conditions, there is often very limited sources of dietary protein that is available to the population. So that means that the RET meats or polony being available is the only affordable source of protein, but at the same time, it is the only one that before the outbreak started was available and could be consumed without cooking it. So that was a large contributing factor to a widespread consumption of this product. Second aspect that we identified was the fact that even though the polony could be consumed uncooked, it made it also very convenient for other consumers, even people that were economically a little bit better off. And thus, this indicates that any health promotions campaign about the risks from consuming uncooked RET meats need to target all strata of society, thus mitigating any risks of listeriosis outbreak in the future. So the way forward, health promotion campaigns will have to be targeted across all strata of society. Consultative platforms and fora, which would include meat producers, meat consumers, and also government officials, should be put together and focus specifically on food security and also food safety in the context of meat production and beyond, so that the further outbreak and factors that might have contributed to it, such as the availability of affordable meat proteins and dietary proteins to South African, can be resolved without compromising anyone's interest. That includes the consumers, the producers, and also government officials. And then also one thing which needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency is what we called in our full paper, etiology of historic inequalities, aka we need to undo and quickly eliminate factors that contribute to the spatial separation between people or consumers of food consumers and the sources of affordable and nutritious dietary protein. And with that, these are my references. Thank you very much for your attention.
Roman, thank you very much. It was really interesting, and look for some questions if there are some. If not, I have, obviously. I believe that your work is very useful and important, and I would like to know, how is this relation of your work to government? If it is welcomed by the government, or if it's ordered by the government, or if you have to push it to the government or sell it to the government or the people, other organization, what is in fact the delivery of the results of your research to the public?
Thank you. Thank you very much. So at the local government level, we have a pretty good working relationship with the local disaster management and also healthcare officials, especially at the local government level and also at the district level. So one level up below provincial. When it comes to the national government, we have passed on some of our findings about listeriosis onto the National Institute of Communicable Diseases that happened recently, specifically researchers that were interested in our work, should I say, not NICD per se as an institution. But the one thing which is quite interesting is that in the context of the COVID-19 outbreak, COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a lot of move and integration between the government's and healthcare response at various levels. Individually speaking, there is quite a strong scientific background and scientific research capacity, which is being adopted by government quite extensively, especially during the outbreak, and also during the listeriosis epidemic. We call it an epidemic rather than an outbreak due to the wide-ranging impact on society. To answer your question in short, at the local government level, we have a really good working relationship with the Department of Health and also with certain disaster management structures. And at the national level, the scientific community, I think, has the same with the national government.
Okay, so once more, thank you very much for your nice presentation. And we're supposed to have here Joe Leitmann. As the man who has very broad CV with a lot of experience. He worked as now has been working in international resilience expert, which is the company Rapid LLC, which is his company, as I understand. But before he worked for the World Bank with several projects as a lead disaster risk management specialist, program manager, environment and DRM coordinator, team leader, senior urban planner, etc., etc. So that many appointments, very interesting, which are very close to the subject we are now going to review. His education is City and Regional Planning College of Environment and Design. He has the PhD since 1992. Then University of California, Berkeley, Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, and yes, at this, and then he speaks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 languages, including Maori, and he has published many books and articles. He's also teaching. He is a visiting professor at Middle East Technical University and Bilkent University in Turkey. And he is also executive director of University of California Disaster Resilience Network. And he is fellow in Royal Geographic Society, working in teams. And he has dual nationality, one USA, second Austria in European Union. So he is really a worldwide reach. So please, Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yaroslav, for that comprehensive introduction. It makes me feel very old. So you're probably wondering why this topic of reimagining preparedness, response, and resilience in the post-COVID world is in this session when there was a session on COVID specifically in the conference. And that's largely because of the time differences. I'm connecting with you from Washington, DC, and the organizers were kind enough to give me a civilized time slot. So here I am in your session. I just wanted to preface my presentation by saying that this work was done based on a consultancy with the World Bank, where we were working with the government of Turkey earlier this year to assess their preparedness and response to COVID. And we thought that it would be useful to assemble a set of international good practice to benchmark, in a sense, the performance of Turkey. So I'm really going to focus much more on that international good practice. We put together case studies of 6 different countries that seem to have performed better in preparedness, response, and recovery as well. And those would be Australia, Denmark, New Zealand, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. In other words, what you might call the usual suspects. Because of the time limits of the presentation, we won't get into the individual cases, but you can find those references and those details in the paper itself that's part of the conference. Well, first, just a recap of where we're at with COVID. More than 250 million cases confirmed globally, 5.2 million fatalities. We think that based on modeling of predicted versus actual fatalities, that figure is low, and it's likely to be much higher, as much as 50% higher. So very, very serious mortality consequences. And then, of course, the usual economic impacts. This is the fastest drop in growth that we've experienced in more than 30 years. It has a consequence of having pushed more than 100 million people into extreme poverty. And this is the first reversal in poverty alleviation that we've seen in a decade. The poverty incidence has been going down for a decade. This is our first step backwards. And then long-term consequences, especially for the 1.5 billion students who were out of school during the school closure period. And we think that that could have a massive impact on future earnings of those students. So all very serious consequences. Now, what we did is we put together a bit of a set of characteristics of what makes COVID an unprecedented challenge, and then what's the storyline behind those challenges. So we find that there are at least 6 factors that make it different. One is the importance of data, that more than ever, we need real-time data in order to inform decision-making. A second is the importance of communications, not only amongst government and private sector actors, but between government and the public. The third is what we've seen with logistics and how the global supply chain can enable or disable the response to COVID. The fourth area is the cross-cutting impact of the pandemic, that it really has affected all socioeconomic groups, sectors, and jurisdictions as well. It has spared no one, but the fifth point is that there are groups that are particularly vulnerable to the pandemic, to the virus, but also economic sectors that are particularly vulnerable. And then the last point is that more than ever, because of the massive impact of the pandemic, this gives us that opportunity to build resilience, to build back better, to help us cope with future risks, whether they be disease or disaster or other types of shocks and stresses. So basically, the storyline linking all these challenges together is that we need reliable information to be generated for better decision making, and that information has to be effectively communicated to stakeholders. The response to the pandemic requires that supplies are available, that actors and their resources are well coordinated, and that we pay particular attention to the needs of vulnerable peoples and economic sectors. And finally, that recovery must be resilient. So you'll recognize some of this from the world of disaster risk management, but some of these points are unique to COVID. So let's quickly go through each of these challenges and look at some of the examples of emerging good practice. So if we're looking at that whole issue of data and how we better link science and information to public policy making, there are 4 good practices that we saw. The first was having a dedicated structure and set of procedures to generate, analyze, and convey data on the pandemic for decision-making. The second area that was important in this crisis was the ability to use digital tools to both obtain and manage information. So we're talking about smart devices, we're talking about crowdsourcing information, and we're talking about transparently managing that information. The third is that it's important to use evidence, scientific evidence, to inform a response strategy. And those of you who followed what happened in the US during the previous administration know the consequences of ignoring that evidence. And then finally, there's a need for different actors, different levels of government, different government agencies to be able to work together to cooperatively develop and share information. So those 4 good practices when it comes to data. The second area is the importance of good communications. And here we start with WHO's recommendation of the importance of developing a communication strategy. You need to have a roadmap to know what are the key messages, who do they need to be communicated to, and then what channels of media are the best ways of bringing those dedicated messages to dedicated audiences. And there's some countries that did this particularly well. Another point here that's important is that one size doesn't fit all. You need a range of methods to communicate with citizens. Some people are very switched into social media, and that's the best way to get them. Senior citizens may not get their information that way. You may have to go old school. So a number of countries recognized this, and they altered their communication strategy to be cognizant of how different people receive information. The third area is there's so much disinformation, so much fake news out there, and a number of countries had aggressive strategies to detect misinformation and disinformation and to immediately correct it so that people weren't misled or confused. And then the last point is that informational needs will change over time, whether it's because the situation has changed, for example, new vaccines are available, or the virus itself has mutated and new approaches are needed, or we're going in and out of lockdown. But you need to adapt your strategy to reflect those changing needs. All right, third good practice has to do with the supply chain. And here, a number of steps were taken to confront the issues of fragility in the global supply chain. The first was there were countries, in fact, Turkey was one of them, that did quite well because they had stockpiled personal protective equipment for emergencies like pandemics. And a number of countries were able to avoid the dependence on international trade by relying on local capacity for equipment, for masks, and for other supplies. A second good practice was that some countries anticipated the availability of the vaccine, so they prepared the groundwork to accelerate the approval and procurement of vaccines even before they had actually been formulated. So they were ready to go as soon as they could get their hands on test results for some of the vaccines. And then the third prudent step that was taken by some countries was to diversify their source of supply. A number of countries that relied entirely on COVAX were disappointed about their ability to get adequate quantities and timely delivery of the vaccines. So the countries that did better were ones that cut deals with different suppliers so that they avoided delays. Okay, fourth point has to do with governance. And here, the three good practices that we detected are, first of all, the importance of having a coordinated response that really drew on the comparative strengths of central and local government. So the challenge here was to have good central capacity and resources to support more autonomous decision-making power at the local level. The second good practice was to be able to link a coordinated system with consistent, clear, and reliable sources of information. And then the final good practice was to be able to have a national and local infectious disease plans in place, but to be able to adapt them as we learn lessons both from past health emergencies. Ebola was a reference point for many African countries, and also to be able to use the real-time information and lessons learned from the ongoing response to the pandemic. Okay, fifth point has to do with vulnerability. And here we found four good practices. The first is to be able to effectively identify in advance who the vulnerable social groups are that would need support. And New Zealand did this using a living standards framework. Many countries use the UN's Human Development Index, but it's a way of making sure you are able to identify and enumerate the people who are potentially vulnerable. The second is you need to back that up with a system of financial support so that you can target the low-income households that are going to be financially hard hit, either because they're facing additional medical expenses or because of the downturn in the economy. So many countries relied on their social protection system and boosted their cash transfer programs to reach those vulnerable poor households. When we talk about vulnerability, we're not just talking about social groups, we're also talking about economic sectors. So the countries that did better had programs in place to target support to micro, small, and medium enterprises, to those people who were self-employed, and to the hardest hit sectors like tourism. And finally, there was a need to implement programs for those citizens who faced special risks. For example, senior citizens, those living in senior care facilities. They first needed to be identified, and then programs had to be put in place to meet their needs and protect them. Finally, we get to recovery and some good practices that are really still emerging because many countries are just embarking on their path to recovery now. The first good practice is that there is a need for a phased recovery program. So that phasing really is, what's the immediate response? How do we put in place economic stimulus packages to counteract the economic downturn? Then you have a medium-term phase, which is to revitalize the economy and particularly the hardest hit sectors. And then a longer-term program where we get back from many countries on the path to sustainable economic growth and achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. There's also a need for a phased approach to reopen the economy and to make that phasing and the triggers for different phases very transparent, and to do it against a very public and closely monitored timetable. The third good practice we've seen is to be able to use the recovery as an opportunity for long-term resilience and growth, the building back better. Many countries use the recovery as an opportunity to invest in, for example, resilience to climate change. And finally, it's important to assess the impact of those stimulus packages that were put in place. So that means you need to establish indicators, monitor them, and report on them over time so that the public is aware of the effectiveness or the ineffectiveness of different stimulus measures that have been put in place. So let me stop there. That's a lot to digest, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Over to you, Jaroslav.
Thank you very much, Joe. It was really comprehensive and very structured. So thank you. I like it. So let's look for some questions. Before they start coming, maybe I would have a question about you. You told about some measures or some ways how to improve the situation, especially with COVID situation, but it applies for all other crises. Do you think that I asked this question today before already, but I will ask it again. what do you see is the impact of this COVID situation and the logistics and problems with the logistics, and with the with something which we may call deglobalization? You told about the stocking of some local stocking of something, etc. So that the ideal system, which was the on-time supplies, is seems to be not to the future, not the best, not the best system for the whole world to treat the logistics. So, what do you think is the impact of COVID situation to this structure of a new processes worldwide?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to completely reshape global trade. We're still going to be dealing with comparative advantages of different countries and regions to more efficiently produce and sell goods and services. But I think it will lead to the two responses that we saw in good practice. The first is to be able to make the most of the existing global trade system by, as you said, stockpiling for future crises. So countries can get the best price available for key goods by anticipating their needs in advance. But they want to certainly buy insurance. And we're seeing this not just in the COVID response, but in manufacturing in general, that people are looking to source goods and services more locally, even if that means a higher cost, because they're looking at the life cycle cost. What if there is a disruption? How will that affect my business? How will that affect my service? And it may be prudent to pay a higher price for a guaranteed source of supply than risk the disruption in the future. So I think we're going to see those two trends, not just in time anymore, having that stockpile of critical parts or inputs, and then more local or more secure procurement of goods and services for critical outputs.
May I have a more general question? What do you think that helps and what hinders the implementation of those good practices in general?
Well, let's start with leadership. If you have a government in power that doesn't believe the science, that doesn't trust its public agencies, that wants to pander to a certain segment of public opinion, then it's very difficult to put much of this in place. So it really starts with leadership, I think. Then I think that you need to have a government structure that believes in and is able to acquire real-time data, is able to analyze it, and then is able to communicate it to the broader public. And finally, I think that you need a system that has exhibited in the past good inter and intra-governmental coordination. So you need to have the ability for national agencies to communicate and work well together. That's more the exception than the rule. And you need that good relation between a central government that maybe sets standards and provides resources, but local governments that are able to tailor the response to local needs. So I would say it's those three factors just off the bat.
Yeah, thank you. We had here morning a nice presentation about the exercising of organizations and multi-organization exercising. So that might be in combination with this, might be a good tool for improving the whole system. There is a synergy sort of.
Very good and instructive and constructive presentation, Joe. I like to add one thing to this, which Norway, I live in Oslo, in Norway. We have done pretty well in handling the pandemic. Now it's back and rising again. So yesterday we had new rules and with protection, etc. But still, we have been handling it well. But also we were late in getting in on the right things. We had to learn. And even our former Prime Minister, Gro Harlem Brundtland, she was the leader of WHO, former leader, and they did a risk analysis just the fall before this and predicted something like this. No one took this seriously. But why did Norway come out of this in a pretty good way so far? Two things: high trust in authorities in the northern countries. Second thing, we have one of the largest investment funds in the world due to the oil industry, and they were able to help people and businesses in order to survive the crisis. So those things were doing very well for us in Norway. But I think you pointed out these things very clearly.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And we chose a different Scandinavian country, Denmark, as a case study, largely because of their investment in recovery being considered to be good practice. But your point about not only having a good recovery plan, but being able to finance it is critical. And so many poorer countries are now in highly indebted situations because they recognized and they responded to the need for stimulus packages, but they didn't have the resources to pay for it, so they borrowed. I think it was the right thing to do, but I now think the international community needs to step up to the plate and revisit that indebtedness and help them out to reduce it and allow them to get back to longer term growth.
Okay, thank you very much. I will have to leave. I will not be at the next session. Harald will take over next session. And so I would like to thank all the speakers, all the attendees, and especially Victoria for the excellent technical support. So thank you very much, and see you tomorrow or next next occasion. Thank you. Enjoy your coffee.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, we go into a break now, and we will be back 3:35, and I will continue. We will have a session on international certification. So see you in 20 minutes. Enjoy your tea, coffee, or water break. Thank you.